Today we're going to talk about creating a wax model for casting. As you can see, the essential question is, why is creating a wax model and attaching it to a sprue base properly necessary in lost wax casting? Underneath, you can also see that there's wax model Cornell notes that you can copy in order to take some notes for this process. You could also do that in your sketchbook if you'd prefer. The learning targets for this portion of the assignment are: I understand the tools, techniques, and order of the casting process in order to create a piece that is well crafted, has form, and is shiny. I understand all safety protocols to protect my body and others during the casting process, and I understand different working techniques to create a wax model to create a cast piece that follows the requirements. As we learned before, lost wax casting is a process in which you create a model, then you create a mold and you burn out the wax model and put metal where the wax model was. On the bottom left of this slide, you can see the centrifuge that is used in order to shoot the metal into the mold by gravitational force. The requirements for this assignment will be a design that is completely 3D form, which means it moves in the X, Y, and Z axes. The design should also have positive and negative space, and the design should have areas of texture and smooth. The design should also be finely crafted and shiny at the end. Here you can see the model you'll be creating is going to be made out of wax. On the left-hand side, you can see the model by itself before anything's been done. In the middle, you can see that it's been marked up, and on the right-hand side, you can see a finished version of a model before it's been cast. When you're creating the sketches for your wax model, it's a good idea to draw multiple views of the model. You can draw it, but you can also make a plasticine clay model of your design. Part of the reason that you want to have a top, a side view, and a second side view is so that you really see all of the parts of the design that you're trying to create. Again, that's the X, Y, and Z axis. It's highly recommended you create a piece without a stone as your first piece because it's easier. Even though we have yet to make your design, we're going to talk about the steps it will take to create the wax model. Again, you should ask 3 other people questions that you may have of the process and then ask your instructor. When we begin, you're going to use a ring sizer to figure out how big your finger is in order to create the right size hole for the model you're creating. The second step is you're going to take the ring sizer and use a scribe, which you can see on the bottom right, in order to mark on your model where you're going to file away to make the model fit your finger. After you've made that mark, it's highly suggested that you outline it with a silver Sharpie like what you can see on the right, and then you're going to take a half round file in order to make the model large enough for your finger. You can also use a Dremel tool to carve out the inside of the ring, but you need to use a very low speed as you do that because you may go past where you want the ring to be. Again, it's a good idea to use a half round file for this process because while it's slower, it is more accurate. Another thing to note is that your final touches should always be done with a file and then with sandpaper. We'll talk about that again as we move forward. Here you can see the wax model has been filed so that it fits someone's finger. The next step is to actually carve off portions of the wax so that you can start carving the design of your ring into the overall wax model. Again, it's important to show multiple views so that you understand what parts you need to carve. When we carve the ring, it's a subtractive process. So again, you're going to be filing out the inside of the ring, and then you're going to be carving portions of that model in order to create the 3D form that you need on the ring. Again, 3D means you're going in the X, Y, and Z axis. As you are creating that, you're going to be finishing by filing and sanding the model in order to have less work in metal when you're done. Just like we've discussed before, there are potential design flaws that you could have in the structural stability or in the wearability of the jewelry. Here you can see a model that has very sharp edges, which again is not recommended because it could poke a finger or potentially snag your clothes. Additionally, both of the models that you see on this hand actually are too large because they separate the fingers. When you are actually wearing a ring, what you should notice about professionally made rings is that your fingers should be able to touch even though the ring is on your finger. So that means you have to file down the sides of the model in order to make it appropriately sized and fit your finger so that your fingers do not separate. When you're carving, filing, and sanding your wax model, there are different things that you're going to need to use. You'll need to use a wax dowel. It's going to help support the wax while you're carving on it so that your model doesn't break. You also could use wax files and wax carving tools or dental tools in order to carve the model. At the end, you will need to use your regular metal files and sandpaper in order to finish your model so that there's not as much cleanup when it becomes metal. Remember, wax is much easier to file and sand than metal is, so we want to do the cleanup when it's in wax. Again, if we take a look at these, you can use wax saw blades to cut things, and notice how the wax saw blades are actually twisted. They're not as straight as the other saw blades we use for cutting metal. You can also use dental tools. There's lots of different shapes that you can use. You can heat up the dental tools and actually carve into the wax, and there's many different shapes that you can use to do that. You should also notice that there's wax files, and again, the wax files are going to have larger teeth in it so that the wax can fall away as you are filing the major form part of your model. At the end, you are going to use regular files and sandpaper in order to make your model well crafted. This example shows again using a dowel and a piece of paper in order to create your model. You do want to have enough paper around the dowel so that it supports your model appropriately. You don't want to stick the model over a dowel that has so much paper that it will break your model. It should fit snug but not break the model. We talked a little earlier about using an alcohol lamp to either carve or add wax to your model. Both of those things will take practice in order to do them well. Another thing that you'll need to do is you'll have to create texture on portions of the surface of your model with some sort of tool. You will additionally need to hollow out the space to reduce the weight of your piece. The more a piece weighs, the heavier it is on your finger, which is uncomfortable, and it also makes the piece more expensive. Remember, we're going to be filing and sanding the wax model because it's much easier to file and sand wax. You can actually even sand all the way up to 600 grit sandpaper. There will still be some areas that you won't be able to sand in a moment. If you're thinking of using a Dremel tool to grind and buff your cast piece, you do need to make sure that you use a low speed like we had talked about before. And just so that you are aware, filing and sanding is much more accurate. Another thing that we'll need to talk about with your model is that you should be using positive and negative spaces, and you'll have to create a sprue. We'll show you the right size of sprue in a little bit. Again, we're talking about hollowing out the back side so that it's not as expensive or heavy when you wear it on your finger. When you create your model, it's a good idea to have some sort of design in the ring band that you have to create more interest. Here you can also see the pink and yellow sprue wax that will be used to create the sprues for the model to make sure that the metal flows where it needs to go. These are some ring examples after they have been cast. The one on the very right has not actually been pickled yet, which is why it's got so much black on it. And the one in the middle that's a bigger square actually is pewter rather than silver. While pewter is less expensive than silver, it's actually going to make your finger turn green. So really we want to be using silver as we are casting our rings. One of the last steps for the model making process is attaching the sprues. Remember, it's the pink and yellow wax we just saw. You will be attaching the model to a rubber stopper and then creating some calculations in order to make sure that your piece actually casts. Proper sprue attachment means that the piece will actually turn out. Here you can see an example of a sprue. Notice that the sprue is larger than the piece that we saw before, but it's not very long. One thing you need to think about when attaching sprues is that you need to put the sprue on the largest mass area of your model. Here it's actually upside down because there's no design on this particular ring. You do need to make sure that you're paying attention to things that will affect the flow of the metal with the sprue or that might affect your design. So this image actually shows you correct and incorrect ways of spruing your model in order to make them work. I would highly suggest that you take a picture of this page so that you really understand how to sprue so that your piece will actually turn out. When you're spruing, you need to pay attention to the way that metal will flow in order to promote the flow of metal to your model very quickly, because metal will cool quickly when the heat is removed. Hopefully you can tell the image on the left that says right above it has angles of sprues that make it so that the model will actually turn out. The reason that it doesn't work on the one on the right is that part of the model is beneath the button on the rubber stopper, and there's also a right angle, and metal is going to stop flowing right in that corner. So it's a good idea to have your sprues go directly to where they are trying to get the metal to flow. Even on this one, I would suggest that this part is not correct because I would have this sprue going all the way down to the base. And realistically, these sprues should be more tightly together on that rubber stopper. This shows you a more close-up view. Again, the reason that you're seeing right and wrong, we'll talk about the wrong first. Wrong is because it's misdirecting the metal. So on the wrong example of what looks like a goose on the top there, that's what that model is, if you can see that or not. But you can see how the metal would go backwards on itself. It's at a down angle as opposed to the one that's correct. All of the metal is flowing away from the sprue, which is why that one would work. On the bottom image, the reason that it's wrong on the left is that there's large flat areas there that are going to need to have sprues going directly to them or they will not cast. Again, it's all about the flow of metal. You want the metal to have no resistance as it's being pushed into the mold so that it actually casts. That is also why the sprues on this example down here actually are bad, because it's not a straight sprue. So here's a really great example of straight sprues going to different sections. This person actually made a piece that doesn't touch, so all of those pieces that you're seeing are free flowing at the end as well because of how the piece was designed. The biggest, most important part of this, though, is that all of those sprues go directly to the different shapes that they are supporting. If you have hollowed out spaces in your design, you want to make sure that the investment can actually go inside of them, which is why you're seeing here the sprue is on the bottom portions of that shell and the opening is up toward the top so that it can be filled with investment. You don't want to create air bubbles, because air bubbles that collect will make a large amount of metal gather toward it, which will make your piece have problems that you'll have to deal with later in metal. Again, we just wanted to show a smooth and straight example of sprues. The one problem down here on the bottom is they really should be more like a tree trunk on the bottom. Again, you're trying to make a straight sprue so that the metal flows as fast as possible to the most important parts of the design, and yet also makes metal flow to all of the design. Often, you want to have at least 2 sprues on your piece. When in doubt, add a sprue. When you're attaching sprues to your model, it's the best to create what looks like the trunk of a tree. So hopefully you can see how wax goes outward toward the model, just like a tree trunk would attach to the ground. Sometimes you might actually have to create sprues on a textured portion of your piece because of a hollowing that is on the back side. That is why this piece was sprued the way that it is. There's a sprue on the right hand side that has been altered with a hot tool, and it really should be replaced before the person tries to cast this, or that piece might not cast. Again, if you have a textural area to a piece, it's best to sprue it on a side if it's at all possible. Again, I'm showing you this example because there was nowhere else to sprue this piece because there's a hollowing on the bottom part in order to make the piece lighter so that the person did not have to pay as much to make that piece function. Sometimes you'll be able to cast more than one piece at a time. This example shows you 2 rings being attached to a rubber stopper all at once in order to cast them at the same time. This means you could also buddy up with someone in class to make sure that you have a partner to help you ensure the accuracy of your calculations and the entire process. This slide just shows you the rubber stopper that you'll be attaching your model to and the flask that goes around your model and into the rubber stopper in order to contain the investment or the plaster that's going to go around your piece before you actually burn out the wax. This image just shows someone using an alcohol lamp and the pink sprue wax as well as a dental tool in order to create the sprues for their piece. Hopefully you can see here, this person took their rubber stopper off and it was centered in the flask. So it's really important to make sure that your model fits appropriately in the flask before you are trying to invest it. This diagram shows that you're going to have at least a 1/2 inch of space between the top of your model and the top of the flask, as well as a 1/4 inch of space between the model and the sides of the flask. Realistically, this image is actually upside down because they're showing you where you would pour the metal, but that is also where the rubber stopper will be. It's really important to follow all of the different measuring and calculations that we need to do in order to have appropriate investment. This person either used not enough investment or water, or they tried to dry their piece too quickly and the entire mold broke. We had talked about measurements before. It's really important that you have correct weights and correct measurements for your piece. You may have to weigh your piece several times to make sure that you have the correct measurements. It's also important for you to attach your sprues to the rubber stopper, weigh it together, then take the piece off and weigh the rubber stopper alone in order to do your calculations correctly. It's also imperative that you check the fit of your rubber stopper and your flask several times before you attach your model to the stopper. You want to make sure that there is a very snug fit because when you pour the investment into your piece, it's going to be liquid at first and you don't want everything to flow right out of the piece. This image shows someone weighing their model before they're actually starting to calculate what they need in terms of metal in order to cast their piece. Here is the casting calculation sheet. It will also be in the investment presentation. Once you've weighed and calculated your piece, you can put the flask back onto the rubber stopper and invest your piece. It's a really good idea to put masking tape with your name on the flask because at this point, everyone's piece looks the same. If, for whatever reason, the investment flows out of your piece or your model floats to the top of the investment when it's liquid, it's important to start over immediately. That means washing out all of the pieces, the flask, the rubber stopper, and your model, and starting the process over. This does sometimes happen to people, but if you follow the directions in the videos, you should be okay. Once the piece is cast, you're going to cut off the sprues and you're going to use a Dremel files sanding and buffing to make it look as professional as possible. Now on to our wax model gallery. Here you can see people using the alcohol lamps and the different dental tools in order to add and subtract wax to create their models. Notice they're also using files in order to refine what they're making so that their model looks exactly the way that they want. This model is an example of a fox made into a ring. Many of the pieces of wax we have are inside the cabinets in the back of the room, but they will most likely be on either the example table or a cart in order to have ease of use. Now we need to talk about leveling up. So once you've done your practice ring model, you could also potentially make small scale sculpture. Here a person is starting to make a deer out of blue block wax, and you can see that they've drawn on different areas with Sharpie in order to see where they needed to carve. This is the final version of that deer as a sculpture. You can also use sheet wax and wax wire in order to create parts of your design. That is more advanced, and you'll probably need some practice to do that. Again, using the alcohol lamps and the different tools will also take some practice in order for you to be careful enough not to melt the wax or your model. You should now be able to answer the essential question from the beginning.